Let's go. Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to week number 12 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. If you're watching these videos as they come live, then happy Easter weekend to you. Although, strictly speaking, we don't really know about Easter yet. We're not going to find out about that until well and truly toward the end of our reading. So happy Passover is probably what I should say. Happy Passover. Well, here we are, week 12. We're reading through the Old Testament, of course, and we're finding ourselves in the period of the Judges. Essentially, this is a 300-year period, between the leadership of Joshua, who took over from Moses, as the people are now into the Promised Land, the leadership of Joshua, and ultimately, and we'll get there this week, the leadership of the prophet Samuel, who transitions Israel into a kingdom. Transitions Israel and gives them their first king. Samuel becomes the final judge in this period of history, and a whole new structure for Israel's development, takes place as Israel gets a king. So that's basically where we're headed this week as we finish off the book of Judges, the last 5 chapters. We're going to read the book of Ruth, beautiful little story to throw in there, and then head on into the book of Samuel, where we'll be spending the next couple of weeks. All right, so what I want to do in this video is just have a look at those 3 readings, those 3 narrative books that we're going to be touching this week, and then mention something that's a little subtle, but I think you might appreciate, and I just want to bring to your attention as we move forward in the story. Okay, so here we go. This week, as we finish off the book of Judges, we're basically doing the last 5 chapters, and the chapter break that I've chosen here in the readings is very deliberate, starting this week in chapter 17, because these last 5 chapters of Judges really are a unique or distinct part of the book. Okay, what you're going to find this week is these last 5 chapters of Judges don't mention a new judge. Okay, this whole cycle we've seen, the sin cycle of Israel being strong, then sinning, then suffering, then calling out to God, and then in giving them a judge to rescue him, and that whole cycle repeating itself. That's not what happens in these last 5 chapters. Instead, what we read is a very disturbing and ultimately quite devastating story of a very serious and brutal assault on the wife, or the concubine strictly speaking, of a Levite man who we think might be a descendant of Moses. And this assault, which took place in a town within the tribe of Benjamin, basically results in a civil war, where all of Israel gangs up against Benjamin because of this horrific assault and almost wipes them out. They relent, like last minute, sparing a few hundred of the men so that they don't completely destroy the memory of Benjamin from their existence, And then they have to find wives for these men from their own tribes, which is a whole nother story. It's just going to blow your mind. R-rated, by the way. Trigger warning, very difficult reading this week. This story in the last 5 chapters does not make children's picture book Bibles, you won't find it in there. It's very disturbing. So this story, basically, at the end of the day, is it almost wipes out Benjamin, and that's essentially how the book of Judges finishes, with this very, very tragic story. So basically, just a heads up, that's what you're going to be reading this week. However, there's another thing that you're really going to notice, is that we're introduced this week to a phrase that we've not seen before, that within those 5 chapters is repeated 4 times. Chapter 17, 18, 19, and 21. In fact, the whole book of Judges closes with this repeated statement. In those days, Israel had no king. In those days, Israel had no king, which tells us something. It tells us that the book of Judges was written when Israel did have a king, and the author is looking back to this terrible, tragic era. So obviously, the author wants us to know that having a king is kind of a good thing, When we didn't have a king, things weren't going too well for us as a nation. And so, in a sense, Judges serves as a bit of a promotional piece, you might say, to people to say, listen, it's good that we've got a king. Just keep that in mind as you read. Second thing we're doing is reading the book of Ruth, which is 4 chapters, and I insist you do that in one sitting, You must. It is a short story. It's a beautiful short story. It is elegantly structured. All right, those who read Hebrew tell us that the introduction is exactly 71 words. The conclusion is exactly 71 words, all right? And in between, we have this story with 4 very distinct movements, or 4 distinct acts, if you consider it like a play, 4 episodes of a show, right? 4 acts in between that paints this beautiful story. It begins introducing us to some key characters, including a man called Elimelech. okay, which incidentally means my God is king. So again, there's that theme there again of kingship, okay? My God is king, and Elimelech dies. Okay, God is no longer king, basically. Elimelech dies. He leaves a widow behind whose name's Naomi. Her sons died, leaving her alone with her 2 daughters-in-law. One of them is Ruth. And because they're living in a foreign land at this time called Moab, they now go back to the homeland in the tribe of Judah. This story is based around Judah, to a town basically around Bethlehem, or called Bethlehem, okay? So that is where the story is based. And long story short, or maybe I should just say short story short, because it is a short story, is that the daughter of Naomi, this Moabite woman, marries someone in Elimelech's family. Because as we remember, reading Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25, if a poor person has a plot of land and they're widowed, okay, it is an obligation on a near family member to take that land on. Okay, so it's not ruined and it stays in the family name, and also to marry any widows and to give them children so that the dead man's name and legacy can live on. Okay, this thing's called kinsman redeemer. Redeemer means to purchase. A kinsman is a relative. So a relative that purchases and promotes the family name. That's basically how all that whole thing works. Anyway, the idea, besides being a nice little love story and a beautiful relief after the terrible story that ends Judges, okay? The idea of this story is to close by telling us where King David's lineage comes from. All right, the son that is born to this lady Ruth, he becomes the grandfather of David, which means he ends up in the genealogy of Jesus, and I'll mention something a little bit about that later. Anyway, it gives us a bit of an idea again as to when Ruth was written. It was written in the time of the kings, and it was written at a time when it was important that people feel good about David and who David was and where his background came from. So again, a bit of a promotional piece, not just for having a king in general, but for having David as king. Okay, so that's probably one of the subtle intents of that story. All right, enjoy Ruth this week, and as I said, you have to read it in one sitting. And then lastly, we hit into the first 15 chapters of Samuel, and we're going to be spending the next couple of weeks in Samuel. This week we're introduced to 2 major characters. The prophet Samuel, who I mentioned before, is the last judge of Israel, okay, and then King Saul, the first ever king. And basically what happens is that Samuel is recognized nationally, from the north to the south. Literally, the whole of Israel appreciates Samuel. He's not so much a military leader like some of the other judges, although he does pray for supernatural victory, and God gives the army supernatural victory because of his prayer. But he really is recognized as a prophet and as a wise man. Okay, in his time, people from all over Israel would listen to him, and basically, as a result of his ministry, they served God and they enjoyed a time of peace. But Samuel does something that's unlike all the other judges. In his old age, and we don't know why he does this, okay, he decides to appoint his sons as leaders after him, as his successors. Now, no other judge has done this before. I spoke about this last week. Gideon, the people came to Gideon, remember, and said, Gideon, please appoint your sons so that when you die, we've got your sons to lead us. And he refuses. But Samuel comes up, as it were, with this idea on his own, and he appoints his sons. Well, it doesn't go down very well. The people don't like him. They're actually very poor leaders. But it gives the people an idea. They come to Samuel and they say, listen, we like this idea of knowing who the next leader is going to be, so why don't you give us a king? Because when we have a king, we'll have a monarchy. And in a monarchy, the king's son will naturally inherit the throne. We will always know who it is that's going to lead us. You see, to this point in history, God's people had to call out for a leader and trust God to give them the right leader at the right time when he felt they needed one. But under a monarchy, they wouldn't have to trust God anymore. They could trust the system. They would have a system to look after them instead. And they asked for a king, and ultimately why God doesn't like this idea, it doesn't surprise him, and it doesn't surprise us, because 350 years earlier, Moses prophesied this was going to happen in Deuteronomy 17. He said, when you enter the land, you will ask for a king. Just make sure that you tell him this when you ordain him, okay? So God says to Samuel, give the people what they say. And Samuel does the most unique thing, the way this whole kingship thing works, okay? He doesn't choose one of his sons to be king. That's probably not a good idea. Nobody likes them. So he doesn't choose one of his sons. He doesn't choose a general from the army, from the military that everyone already respects. He doesn't choose a man from his own tribe, which would make sense. Okay, I'm a Levite, I'm going to choose a Levite to lead. He doesn't throw the candidacy open to auditions or applications. And he doesn't go back to the book of Genesis to see if there was any prophetic hint of where a king should come from. Remember Jacob at the end of his life prayed over his sons, over all the tribes, and one of those tribes he said would be leader of the other. No. Samuel doesn't go back to the Bible. Instead, God just speaks to him out of the blue. And he says, mate, this time tomorrow, I'm going to bring the king I have chosen to you. And guess what? He's going to come from the tribe of Benjamin. Incredible. The tribe that nearly got wiped out just recently at the end of the book of Judges. That is where the king is going to come from. The tribe that basically everyone else despises. That is where I am going to choose the first king of Israel. Now that, in a sense, comes as a bit of a shock or a surprise to us. God, what are you doing? Well, politically speaking, if you think politically for a moment, there is wisdom to that. Okay, if God had chosen a king from one of the big tribes, there may have always been this thought in the other tribes' minds that that tribe is trying to take us over. That tribe is trying to dominate us. By choosing Benjamin, the weakest, then it was quite clear, well, no, this is God's choice. Okay, so there's political wisdom in there, if you can imagine God thinking politically. But it is strange because as you look back through the prophecy of Jacob as he dies, Benjamin is not mentioned as a future leader. There is no indication that we should expect a king from Benjamin. On the exception, or what we should do otherwise, is we should expect a king from the tribe of Judah instead. Okay, that's the word I was trying to find for. Instead, we should be expecting a king from Judah because that is the tribe that Jacob says a ruler will come from. And it's here that I want you to pay attention to something that is quite subtle this week, but I feel is important. And it's the distinction between the tribe of Benjamin and Judah. Benjamin and Judah. Okay? At both the beginning and the end of Judges, the author contrasts Benjamin and Judah. And you probably missed it in the first chapter of Judges, but right at the very beginning, the very first story we come across says that after they come into the promised land and Joshua dies, the first tribe to take on battles and to win promised land for themselves was the tribe of Judah. Judah led the way as a military force, and one of the cities they actually took over was a city called Jerusalem. But the Benjamites harbored people from Jerusalem, the Jebusites, kept them alive, and then they rebuilt Jerusalem. It's as if the tribe of Benjamin were undoing the good work of Judah. Well, at the end of the book of Judges, what do we see? Again, we see a story contrasting Judah and Benjamin. The men of Benjamin assaulted a woman from Judah. Okay? And when the armies gather against Benjamin to take them out, they draw lots. Which tribe should fight Benjamin first? And guess who's chosen? Judah. And although they suffer casualties, eventually they take them over. And as I said before, Benjamin wipes out. What's the point, Chad? The point is, from both the beginning and the end of Judges, the author is drawing our attention to the fact of the difference between Benjamin and Judah. Of all the other tribes, why these two? Benjamin and Judah, and how Judah is somehow better than Benjamin. Well, what does the book of Ruth do? As I mentioned before, the book of Ruth is based in, guess where? Judah. It's about a family from that tribe, and it's about a man from that tribe called Boaz. Now, of course, I understand Ruth's about two women, two great heroic women, and I'm not taking any of that away. But there's also a great male hero in the story of Ruth, and I really want you to pay attention to that this week. The heroic qualities of Boaz. Honourable, trustworthy, generous, compassionate, kind, faithful, bold, and yet humble. He's highlighting the men of Judah are trustworthy men. It's almost as if, as this whole story builds towards Israel becoming a kingdom, asking a king to lead them, that the author wants us to see there's something about Judah, all right? There's something about the men of Judah that have all the good qualities of leadership, and particularly when you contrast it against the men of Benjamin. You can trust Judah, you can't really trust Benjamin, and it's as if the author is subtly pointing us in that direction as Israel enters their kingdom era. Okay, I wonder why that would be. But again, the basic story here this week, guys, is that we're moving in Israel's history from the Bible being the story of God's relationship with one man, to God's relationship with one family, to God's relationship with one nation led by judges, to now having a covenant with not a nation, but a kingdom. Okay, the kingdom of Israel led by kings. And although the first king is from Benjamin, there are hints that maybe that's not actually the way forward. Maybe instead we should be looking at Judah. After all, the character and caliber of those men seem to be superior, but that might be a subtle hint. We'll see how we go as we read. All right, that's enough for today. Guys, enjoy your readings. It really is a jam-packed readings. Trigger warning as we close out the book of Judges. Please read Ruth in one sitting and enjoy Samuel. We're going to be there for a few weeks. Bless your heaps. Have a great Easter. I'll see you next week. Bye.